Everyone, welcome. My name is Natalie Walker. I'm the manager of college operations here at the Classic Learning Test. For anyone unfamiliar with the CLT, we are a college entrance exam and assessment suite for grades 7 through 12. One thing that distinguishes the CLT as a test is its content. 2/3 of the passages on any CLT exam come from our author bank. This is a list comprised of men and women who have contributed to the richness of philosophy and thought that we have inherited. They're authors you're likely to encounter in your college career, and hopefully you'll engage with them throughout your life. So most Thursdays of the academic year, to help us develop a true common canon, a faculty member from one of our partner colleges helps us explore one author from the CLT Bank. Tonight is our first Journey Through the Author Bank seminar of the spring semester, and our partner college sponsoring this evening is a very special one. Since 1933, Lancaster Bible College has provided Christian students a nurturing and safe environment to grow academically, spiritually, and personally on their beautiful campus in central Pennsylvania. A biblical worldview frames the entire LBC experience. I'll put a link to their website for you to read more as soon as I've introduced our special guest speaker tonight. Dr. Mark Draper is the Director of Library Services and a Professor of Church History at Lancaster Bible College. He's originally from Philadelphia and earned his PhD in Historical Theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, where he was a Jonathan Edwards Fellow as well. He earned his Master's of Library and Information Science from Drexel University and MA in Christian Thought from the Biblical Seminary and his BA in History from Temple University. He has served as the Assistant Director of the Niebuhr Center for Faith in Action, a library supervisor at the Free Library of Philadelphia, and adjunct professor in history and religion at Elmhurst College. Dr. Draper's research interests include the history of evangelicalism, 18th and 19th century evangelical social reformers and theologians, such as Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, and Gilbert Haven. And tonight he'll introduce us to John Calvin. There will be a question period afterwards, so keep your questions close or feel free to put them in the chat during the lecture, and I'll post them afterwards. So Dr. Draper, thank you for being here.
Thank you, it's a privilege.
Screen is yours.
Excellent, so let's share the screen. Everyone should be able to see the presentation. Okay. Is that good? Can you see everything there?
Looks great. Yes.
Perfect. Excellent. Great. Well, thank you for asking me to do this. This is certainly a privilege to do this. What I want to do tonight, actually, I told our host that I actually had an opportunity to give tours of Geneva on John Calvin. So this is kind of a unique opportunity to be able to speak about John Calvin, not in a classroom, not invited into a Presbyterian church, and not in Geneva. So it'll be fun to have this conversation with everybody and give us an idea of who John Calvin was. And really where I want to lean into tonight is how John Calvin's influence on the American Republic. And so that's what I want to get into with that and explain that a bit tonight. So let me just open up, fix our slides here. Okay. And we're still okay with the slides? Good. What I wanted to do is just kind of get away from just doing sort of just a straight biography of Calvin. There's been a lot of work done on him as far as his role in the Reformation. There's an actual book, just a biography of the Christian Institutes. So that's an issue. There's a whole study, a whole body of literature now, just biographies and life cycles of important pieces of literature. And so you can actually read now a biography, not just of Calvin, but of his famous book, The Institutes of Christian Religion, which we'll talk a little bit about tonight. But what I really want to get is this idea of his influence on the American Republic. And for some people, that might come as a bit of a shock. Like, well, how could John Calvin have anything to do with the American Republic? I thought the American Revolution was all about John Locke and things like that. How did John Calvin come into the story? But the reality is, when you start to read the actual sermons and start reading the American patriots, they're quoting Calvinist theologians. And so we want to talk about that. The other reason I think this is a great way of approaching how to teach history at a Bible college. The beautiful thing about teaching at a Bible college is that when you walk in to teach a class, whether it's the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, you have students who not only are they majors in a field, but they're also majors in Bible. And so you can sort of bring those ideas in if there's a hermeneutical issue, which American Civil War there was. In the American Revolution, there is too. Should Christians revolt against a king? Romans 13, and we're going to talk about that tonight. And so you can bring these together. It's a beautiful way of teaching history. You can present them with the secondary literature, historiography. This one has a nice historical debate about it. Scholars don't agree, so that's always fun. And then you can also talk about primary resources, have them read the institutes, have them read commentaries from this time period, but also wrestle with their own hermeneutics and their own interpretation of scripture as they're working through it. It's a great way to teach history in the sense of helping students understand that as Christians, we are citizens of the city of God, but we're trying to negotiate life in the city of man. And how do we do that? And how have Christians in the past done that? And I think it helps break down that silo that somehow there's church history and then there's like regular history. No, there were Christians through all the events and they were trying to sort that out. So that's an important part for us to get at. The other piece is I think that Christianity tends to get short shrift on the story of the American Revolution. At times, it always seems like Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, Thomas Paine, and then that sort of sets everything up. And we miss the fact that there's actually a very Protestant Reformed theology that's also at play and influencing the patriots at this time. And a lot of people get surprised when they find out that the advisor to King George referred to the entire revolution as a Presbyterian rebellion. So how does that not fit in? That doesn't sound like John Locke. So how do we wrestle with that and how do we understand that? And so what we want to do is talk about that role of Calvinism. And that's an important part too. Whenever we talk about an ism, you have the progenitor of the movement, and then you have the ism. And the ism will always take on a life of its own. And that's certainly what I think we're going to see here. In many ways, the heirs of John Calvin are probably going to move in directions he might not have gone, but it certainly is in keeping. There is a Reformed tradition. So our game plan tonight is one, just to provide a brief sketch of John Calvin, and then we're going to move into Calvin's views on the civil government and demonstrate how he's really kind of carving out a new path from medieval thought. And then we're going to get into those various pieces. And then what we can then talk about is how his ideas on resistance to government, limited government, republicanism, how those ideas are going to develop through various revolutions well before the American Revolution, and how the Americans, Christians, were appropriating it. And so what I can tell you now heading out is that scholars will look at this, and there are some scholars that say, yes, you may have used John Calvin, but you're not a good Calvinist if you want to rebel against the king. Some are going to say, well, your hermeneutics are off. Calvin would have never interpreted the Bible the way John Knox did. And then there's other historians who would say, no, there's actually an evolution development of ideas here. And so that way we kind of know the game plan. There's a reading list to go along with this. It's in the chat. It'll be part of the presentation. And so a lot of the topics I'm talking about, if you want to read more about them, you will have access to bibliography on this topic. So let's dive in. And so the first question we want to ask is, who is John Calvin, right? And why is he important? John Calvin is he is a second generation reformer. He is born in 1509. So if you remember, Martin Luther nails the 95 Thesis in 1517. Calvin is born in 1509. His father is connected. He's an admin with the cathedral there, and is actually able to get Calvin what's called a benefice. And Calvin is able to basically get educated and pick up a salary from the Catholic Church thanks to this benefice. And his father wanted him to be a priest. And he intended for him to go and go into the priesthood. And that was the direction. That's where he started studying for the priesthood until his father had a falling out with the cathedral. And he forced his son to change his major to law. His father would not just have a falling out with the cathedral. At the time of his father's death, he was actually excommunicated from the Catholic Church. And John and his brothers basically had to do some negotiation to get him back installed into the church so that he could be buried in a consecrated grave. So similar to Luther, where Luther's father wants him to be a lawyer and he turns out to be a priest, in this case, we have somebody whose father wants him to be a priest and he ends up being a lawyer or studying law. And he goes to Paris to study law. And in fact, this picture in the middle here is a picture of 16th century Paris. And Paris is a unique place at this time. This is after Luther's writings are coming out. Paris is filled with humanism and the Renaissance movement. The Sorbonne is ground zero for these ideas. The writings of Erasmus of Rotterdam are spreading throughout France. And Erasmus is sort of an early reformer. And kind of a way to understand Erasmus, there's this sort of joke that says the Reformation, Erasmus, that Luther hatched the egg Erasmus laid. And the idea is that Erasmus started challenging some ideas through humanism, in fact, translating the New Testament into Greek, but would never go as far as Luther. In fact, actually went against Luther and they had their debates together in literature. But Erasmian ideas, these are where we're talking about humanism and reforming the church and this type of things. And Calvin will get caught up in this while he's in Paris. He'll become interested in this type of thing. And as he starts to read Luther and starts to read the reformers around the 1530s, Calvin himself will have a conversion movement of sorts, a conversion from Catholic to Protestant, which for him also means giving up his benefits if he's going to be consistent. And so Calvin in the 1530s, studying law, he's in Paris, he will have his conversion. He will become a Protestant. He will talk about this. He gives a number of accounts of what the conversion looked like, what he went through. But the real shift for him is going to be in 1533, where his life is going to take a very strange turn. The rector of the University of Paris, a guy named Nicholas Kopp, will give a speech for the Feast of All Saints. And Kopp is a physician, but he gives a sermon, he gives a lecture that sounds more like he had been reading Erasmus and Luther. And of course, everybody wanted to know what is going on here and who helped this guy write this sermon. And scholars have debated, did Calvin assist? Did Calvin help? No one's really certain. But what happens is the state under the king, Francis I, which is very devout Catholic, starts to clamp down on any of these, what we would call Protestant ideas in France. And then Calvin will have to kind of go underground a little bit. He'll pop back up again, but he will eventually have to flee by 1535, because the Protestants get very brazen in France in 1535, and they start something called the Placard Affair. They're putting placards up all over, Protestant statements, Protestant ideas all over France. And this comes right from Bruce Gordon's biography of John Calvin, including in the king's bedchamber. Well, that is definitely going to get you in trouble with a Catholic king if you're sneaking into his bedchamber at night and you are putting in Protestant slogans. Calvin had nothing to do with this, but sort of guilt by association, and he needs to leave France at this point. And this is where he will head to Switzerland. It is in this time, 1535, 1536, that he will write the first copy of his Christian Institutes. And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. He will eventually end up in Geneva with William Farel to help reform the church in Geneva. It is a failure. These are not winsome reformers. It's their way or the highway. And of course, the Genevan officials were not about to have that. This will make sense in a little bit too. At the time Calvin enters Geneva for the first time in the mid 1530s, the Protestant and the city council had just gotten rid of the bishop, who was not just the bishop, was also the ruler of Geneva at this point. So they were not really interested in going back underneath the tyranny, what they thought, of another religious leader. And so Calvin and Farel's experiment in Geneva was failed. And John Calvin will leave, but he would go to Strasbourg. And this, I think, is one of the most important parts of Calvin's life. He will work with Martin Bucer, the reformer in Strasbourg. I am a huge fan of Martin Bucer. Martin Bucer was what I call the winsome reformer. He tried to bring different groups together. And I think it's this time under Bucer that Calvin really kind of learns a certain polish, learns a little politics. And he starts to see how a first-generation reformer had reformed a city. And this is a very, I think, important part of John Calvin. The fact that John Calvin was a second-generation reformer is extremely important. Where Luther and Zwingli, they're reforming as they go. By the time Calvin returns to Geneva in 1541, he has had time to process. He has had time to be mentored. And he's also been able to see what has worked, what has not worked. He's been able to come up with probably more of a holistic understanding of just what a Protestant city-state should look like. And in particular, in this case, a republican. It is a republic, that Geneva at this time. And so he will return there. Not without his challenges. Relevant to this story, in 1553, he will be involved in the burning of a heretic named Michael Servetus in Geneva. Servetus was an anti-Trinitarian, a brilliant man. Some say that he even discovered the circulation system in the body, but when it came to theology, he was not orthodox. And this is one of those cases when you denied the Trinity, the Catholics and the Protestants could not agree on much, but that one they did. And so you would have been in trouble. He was actually arrested by the Italian Inquisition at one point and was able to escape. But when Calvin comes back, he comes in there, he has to deal with all of these things. And this is Calvin's story. When Calvin enters in 1541, he is now brought in to reform. He is asked to reform the church by the city. It's a very important story here. We now have the political leaders asking the church leaders to do the reforming. So this will raise a big question. Who's in charge of the Reformation? Is it the government or is it the church? And in this case, we can see it's the state is taking the initiative to reform the church in Geneva. Martin Luther will make the same argument that the state needs to be involved in this. And so let's just talk a smidge about that, because I think that's important that once Calvin gets into Geneva, what is happening is this. Prior to the Reformation, there was a time where the Catholic Church was losing a lot of its luster with political leaders. And the political leaders throughout Europe were generally getting more power. Even in France, Francis I had the right to appoint all of the bishops. Sometimes this was a political deal that popes would make with kings to keep them close. Henry VIII had the same sort of arrangement. And so you have this power struggle happening in medieval Europe, leading into the Renaissance and the Humanist period, where the political leaders are trying to gain some power back from the Catholic Church. There was this debate. Of course, throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church really saw themselves as above the civil leaders, right? They were the ones who had to bless the emperors and things like that. And so there's this power struggle taking place. And when we talk about the magisterial reformers, these are the reformers that are working with the governments, the magisteriums like Zwingli and Calvin and Luther. They do believe that the state has a role to play in this bringing about of religious ideas and bringing about reformation. And so there's a power that they're willing to hand to the state in that way to do that. They believe it's a role they play. And Calvin will unpack this even more. And where we start to see Calvin unpack this early on, this is a first copy of the Institutes from Geneva, 1536. He will actually revise this about 5 times in Latin. He will also do a couple translations in France, but they're not quite word for word translations, but they're very similar. But it's in the Institutes where Calvin is going to lay out throughout his various translations, and probably the most important one for our talk is this one in 1559, the last one, the longest one. Some scholars have believed that Calvin had intentions of revising even that one. He just didn't live long enough to do that. But it's in here in the last book, book 4, chapter 20, where he lays out the role of the church in the state. What should that look like? And so that's what we want to spend some time in tonight, because that will help us understand how this affects the American Republic. One of the important things for Calvin is this idea of two kingdoms, that Jesus is over everything, right? But that the civil state and the ecclesiastical state are both part of Christ's reign. They both have roles to play. What he is running into, I am a professor at Lancaster Bible College. We are in Anabaptist country, Mennonites, Amish, Brethren. These reformers, the radical reformers, were not in favor of the state. They believe that once you are a member of the city of heaven, you no longer have any dealings with the state. That's why you have the Amish who live in a very separate way. And you don't have any need for the state. The state is the city of man. We don't get involved with that. And for Calvin and Luther and others, this was just absurdity. It was opening the door to anarchy, is what they were afraid of. And they had seen some of that. There was the peasant revolts in the 1520s in Germany, the Munster debacle of a sort of an Anabaptist commune. And then, of course, you had the fear of lawlessness, just anarchy, if you don't have any state. And where Calvin will argue, that the state has a very important role to play. And he's developing this two-kingdom understanding of the state. What's very important for us to keep in mind is that throughout much of medieval Europe and into the Reformation, the church is operating something known as Christendom. There is a marriage of the church and state. They are not, this idea of separation of church and state, the way we will have it in America, is absolutely foreign to anybody prior to really the American Revolution. That concept was very foreign. And so, but what is the relationship? Obviously, the Catholic Church and the state church, the state governments wasn't exactly what the Protestant reformers wanted. But so what would it look like? So it wasn't as if when they reformed the church that they were just going to throw out Christendom. No, they are revising Christendom in light of Protestant theology. So the state and the church still have to work together. And in fact, for Calvin, the state has a role to play for the church. And you can read this in this quote, that the state, not only are they to protect the church and help the church, they're actually supposed to punish blasphemers. They are to protect true doctrine as well. So it is not just a matter of giving you the right to go to church, but if this is why a seditious case could be a capital crime, because the state could be involved in this. We'll see a similar case in the 5th century with Augustine and the Donatists using the state to punish heresy. This was not a novel idea. And so for Calvin, the two kingdoms, this church and the state, both have roles to play for the Christian. The Christian, one, shows their obedience to the state. And in this, where Calvin will be translating Romans 13, particularly, is it right for a Christian to revolt against the state? And so we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. It gives you a chance to see this quote. Calvin also, as he gets into this idea of civil government, we learn something about him, that he's a Republican, small r, not big R. He is not a member of the GOP. He is a Republican and he favors republicanism. He has an anti-monarch streak in him. He is leery of monarchs. He's actually leery of both extremes. He's leery of direct democracies because then you can have mob rule, and he's afraid of monarchies. Unchecked power is tyranny. And the reason Calvin has these concerns is because of his theological anthropology. He believes men are fallen. He believes humanity is fallen. Even Christians are still dealing with a fallen state. To give anybody absolute power is just a recipe for disaster. whether it's the mob or whether it's the king. And so therefore, he does like this idea of a sort of an aristocracy working with some sort of democracy, maybe with a royalty, some sort of checks and balances. That is his ideal. He's not too harsh as to which version of it, but some version of republicanism is his favorite. Now, this makes sense. He's in Geneva. This is a republic, and which also explains why he's able to operate the way he is. And so we start to see that he has this, but this also means this, though, when you have this holy republic and you have all of this, there's not a lot of room for pluralism. There's not a lot of room for pluralism in this. This is why you will see heretics burned at the stake or exiled or banished or anything like that. The idea is we are creating a holy commonwealth, a holy republic. And therefore, there's not a lot of space for that. In fact, they'll go so far as to say this, that it's okay for, say, Jews or Muslims to be in the republic because they're not Christians. They're not going to deceive a Christian holy republic because they already know, Christians should already know that they are different. The problem is when someone comes in and talks as a Christian and could be deceiving people. And of course, for Calvin too, he will talk a lot about the right of conscience. But what Calvin really wants is he wants a holy commonwealth where they are able to use their conscience to not be Catholic. But that doesn't mean you can move into Geneva and be, say, Mennonite. There's no space for that. So it is a very sort of locked down sort of commonwealth. But he uses these words of conscience and liberty and this type of thing, but it's meant in a very specific way. So we find quickly that he likes republics, he favors them, and this because of his anthropology. Where things get really difficult in this story of how did Calvin affect the American Republic is really his idea of resistance. This is where things get very interesting. And this is where the debate happens over Romans 13, particularly verses 1 to 4. There are entire books written on this, entire articles, some of them in the list that I gave you all. And in here, we see Calvin really taking a hard line that the Christian does not have the right to rebel against a civil magistrate, against a king. He takes Paul very seriously. There's no space for this. There's even letters that Calvin will write to people who are being persecuted for their faith, where he will say, you can pray, you can endure, but you cannot resist. You cannot resist. You cannot revolt. You cannot create a revolution against a monarch. They are there from God. And he will go in great detail to explain this, that you just can't do this. And of course, he doesn't have that issue in Geneva, but we're going to quickly learn that some of his heirs are going to be in a very different situation. The only space he gives you for any type of resistance, one, there's clearly resistance if the king is asking you to do something that is unchristian. Then you can resist by not doing it. So sort of think of Daniel. And just resisting having to pray in a certain way. That is okay for Calvin. Also, the magistrate. So if you read the passage, Paul talks about the powers, plural. And where Calvin is going to say there are some states have multiple powers. You may have a king, but there's lower magistrates. He'll refer to even some of the arrangements in Sparta and in ancient Greece, where you had advisors or an advisory group over a monarchy. And those people are responsible for the liberty and to put down tyranny of a monarch, of a king. And therefore, you can work through the magistrates to do this, but you actually resisting, no. And the magistrates actually resisting, he would have had a very hard time getting that point. And he will never really get to that space. Unfortunately, he won't have to. But the resistance theory is going to get more complicated as Reformed theology spreads out, because you're going to have people who might feel themselves almost in a Bonhoeffer situation. What do you do when the king or the powers are really evil? What do you do with that? The other thing is Calvin's going to open up this sort of this ambiguity where he will say, at times God has brought along ways of overthrowing tyrannical leaders. And he'll quote these different times through ancient history in the Old Testament. Of course, what we're going to see is that we're going to see some of his heirs think, well, I want to be the Syrians, or I want to be the Assyrians, or, how do we do that? And so what we get here is his beginning of resistance theory. Things will really begin to change in the Reformed world under this idea of resistance theory, particularly in France with the St. Bartholomew's massacre in 1517, where Catholics are basically, it's a bit of a pogrom. It's really a pogrom of Protestants. And the French Protestants here are going to move in a more of a resistance model. They're going to kind of push Calvin along here. Now, he's not part of this. He's passed by this point, but his ideas are there. And so the people coming after him, Calvin has created a system and has created understanding really through the lens of his Republic in Geneva. But how can you not have how can you argue that your state should have religious pluralism when you're just trying to survive as Protestants in a Catholic state? In some cases, you have to kind of argue for, well, there has to be multiple ways. So you can see that when the rubber meets the road, sometimes these ideas get processed a little differently. The big shift that the French Calvinists are going to make is what's called sort of a three-part covenant. That the covenant, the three-way covenant, is between God, rulers, and the people. Rulers should agree to support the higher law, so long as leaders protect the rights of the people. People have the right to remove tyrants. But the representatives, again, these lower magistrates, are the ones who should be leveling that. So nobody's calling for private citizens to just start a kind of vigilante regicide. No, not that. But they are going further than Calvin and saying, no, there is a time when you do need to revolt. There is a time when this, another area where this will come into is there's very much a belief that the civil authorities should uphold the 10 Commandments. Well, what happens if the civil authorities are violating the 10 Commandments? And we're actually going to see by the time we get to the Dutch, this is where we start the idea of, well, if the second part of the table of the law says that we should protect family and things like that. Well, what happens if the state's coming after family? What if they're coming after property? What if they're coming after some of these areas? What is the role of the church at that point? And so the French Calvinist move is a huge shift in how Calvinists are going to start to talk about these ideas. And the French will influence the Scots, the Dutch, the English, and of course the Americans. In Holland, we're going to see another situation where Protestants will see their need to revolt in some way because they're being under the thumb of the Spanish. And so this is a quote from 1581, where the Dutch Protestants basically declare a certain independence. Because we have limited time to go too detail into this. This does interest you, I think the work by John Whitty, The Reformation of Rights, which is in the list, is a great book to read for this topic. The person he will focus on here is Johan Ostos. And what's really fascinating about the Dutch is that you have the French who are going to talk about the idea of this three-way covenant, but with the Dutch, we're actually going to start to see constitution language. Well, what happens if the monarch overthrows the constitution, the covenant? And so once you start using this sort of covenantal language, and Calvinists love covenantal language, everything's a covenant. The churches are covenants, the marriage is a covenant, and you name your church a covenant, you name your college a covenant. It's very much in the DNA of Reformed theology. And so once you start connecting a constitution with a covenant, well, now things get a little more complicated, and this idea starts to develop, this resistance theory. What happens if the covenant has been violated by the king? When we move to Scotland, when we're dealing with John Knox. John Knox is somebody who, a little picture here of John Knox. If you didn't know, John Knox is actually buried in the parking lot of his church in Edinburgh at St. Giles. I had a chance to visit that. And of course, you can go up to St. Andrews and see the castle where he was captured by the French and put into the galley. And his friend, George Wishart, was martyred in the street. And in fact, now it is a parking spot as well. So there's something going on in Scotland with Protestant reformers and parking spots. I was a little taken by that. But just parenthetically too, one of the things about the Reformation we have to always be aware of, and I think in America it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this, is the Protestant Reformation was a zero-sum game. It was a life or death game. People died. I can't tell you how many times touring Europe for the Reformation, giving tours in Europe for the Reformation, where I stepped over markers like that GW sitting there on the ground in St. Andrews. I walked where Martin Bucer was burned at the stake. This just happened. People died. This was a zero-sum game. It was for real. This was not just I might get canceled on Twitter. This is I might lose my neck. It is the why someone like John Knox is walking around with a broadsword for protection. You don't walk around with a broadsword to open up your mail. That's a defense. That is a defensive weapon. That's the level where some of this is. And I think it's very easy to kind of have these academic conversations, but for the people who were kind of living it, this was life and death. This was life and death. And of course, John Knox will spend 2 years in the galleys. It will wreck his body. It will affect him for the rest of his life. And so Knox, when he takes off to Geneva to get away from Catholic Scotland, Geneva is really a place for him to learn, to study. He loves Geneva. He really sees it as the example of Protestantism. But it's also there where he starts to develop his resistance theory and starts to challenge what should a Christian do. The other thing that makes this all much more complicated for people, and why they probably moved off of Calvin a little bit in this, is this way. Once you start to see your nation state as a holy commonwealth in some way, or in some ways as a new type of Israel, you start to see leaders using Old Testament texts to justify what to do with an evil king or a Catholic king or a Catholic queen. Also, you start to see the Jeremiad tradition. The lamentation tradition comes out of this. And here you start to see people saying things like, well, look what happened to Israel when they were not loyal to the covenant. Look what happened when they did this. What happens to us if we do that? And you kind of hear that kind of language from John Knox, that sort of almost Old Testament prophet language. And Knox really will be a game changer. He's a turning point where he will always advise against private citizens taking up the sword, but he is a resistance guy. And one of the things he's going to do, it's a hermeneutical move. He's going to read the book of Romans, and particularly the idea where Paul says that we should be submissive to authorities. He's going to say, yes, that's true. But Paul is talking about the position, not the person. In other words, you should submit to the role, the kingly role. But if there is a tyrannical king, that doesn't mean you just give in. So that move he makes is very important, because it's not just a passive obedience. It's creating a distinction between the role and the person in the role. And that will be how he begins to read Romans 13 differently than Calvin, than Bucer, than Beza. And will create this sort of idea of that we have a right. Now, it is ungodly for Knox to not revolt against a tyrannical king who particularly is forcing you to worship in an idolatrous way. And so Knox is really the turning point in this. And it's interesting, if you spend some time in Scotland, and you kind of you learn about Knox, you learn about the Covenanters, you learn about Samuel Rutherford. You actually start to sense a sort of American simpatico here. There's a connection between Scotland and America that's just you can't miss it. Even some of the Enlightenment philosophical traditions will be Scottish common sense realism. There's a connection there, and you can see where this will be used by Americans when they're dealing with their own issues. And so finally, Knox really does defend a resistance theory, and this is a game changer. Of course, then the next story in this is the British Civil War, where the Puritans will actually take off the king's head. There's actual regicide. Okay, so English Civil War, where Charles I will lose his head and a republic is built. Now, you may ask, how do you do that? How do you justify the resistance? Well, one of the ways that Puritans in England would have justified this and would have felt themselves within the Calvinist stream is that, well, Parliament, they're the lower magistrates. They are the ones that led this charge. It wasn't as if this was a private war. It wasn't as if this was some sort of private citizen starting a vigilante regicide. Rather, it was the lower magistrates who had to go to war against the king. And so you can't get a higher, a more challenging way of regicide when Charles I will actually lose his head. I mean, that's you don't get much more than that. But it's also at this same time that the Westminster Confession will be written during this period by Presbyterians from Scotland and England and Congregationalists from England. And so what you'll start to see, and what we're going to see by the time we get to the American Revolution, is that thanks to Knox and the French and the Dutch and now the English, people are going to start to see Calvinism as a resistance, rebellion sort of movement. We're going to look at some quotes later in a couple minutes. But you start to see this trajectory happening. The French developed a resistance, French Calvinists developed a resistance theory. Now you have the Scots doing it. And the Scots actually during the English Civil War, they wanted Presbyterianism to be the state church, not any type of Anglicanism, not a Puritans. They wanted Presbyterianism. So there's this connection here with this. And of course, even before Charles, with his father James, the Puritans thought that he was going to be a little more sympathetic to their cause, but he was like, no. I know what Scotch Presbyterians are like. I could lose my head. They're not too fond of monarchies. So there starts to be this idea within the Anglo-American, in the Anglo world, that Calvinism, Presbyterianism is code for rebellion and resistance. By the time we get to the American Revolution, we start to see some very interesting quotes coming between the loyalists about the people who are opposed to it. A torrent of Presbyterians. This is a great quote here. The legislator here may do well to think of some checks of the torrent of Presbyterian power which prevails in the government to eastward of Pennsylvania. They have still the Orwellian spirit. He's referring to Oliver Cromwell, right? And the republic that they founded there. And so you start to see that as America and England lock horns over the role between the colonies and the state, that the loyalists will use much of this Presbyterian concern. This was interesting. This is General Thomas Gage in America during the Stamp Act. The Presbyterians intend nothing less than the throwing off of their allegiance and obedience to His Majesty and the propriety and forming a Republican empire in America. And so throughout the war, you will see these quotes coming from loyalists, both in England and in America, but particularly the English, that this whole scuffle is really just a Presbyterian row. And what becomes very interesting is at this time period, Presbyterian was code. They weren't too selective in that. They weren't just talking about people who had a session and were truly Presbyterian. They were talking about anybody who's Calvinist. They lumped the New England Congregationalists, the Dutch Reformed in New York, the Presbyterians in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. They're all the same for the Loyalists. And the fear was that they really want a Presbyterian republic. On the other side, people, the Presbyterians, the Calvinists, they were always fearful that if the king is allowed to run unchecked over America, what's next? A state church in America, an Anglican church in America? There was this fear as well. And then what do we do? And so you start to see this back and forth between the loyalists and the patriots on this idea that Presbyterianism is somehow the real root cause. I mean, the quote from the advisor of King George, complaining that Lexington and Concord started at a Presbyterian meeting house, right? I mean, that type of language. So you start to see this back and forth. And in all fairness, it was being used that way. And you see this no better than a guy named John Witherspoon, president of the seminary, known as the Seminary of Sedition. That was Princeton. And of course, John Witherspoon signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a classic example of this Presbyterian reform person with a reformed tradition of revolt tied to it. What we will see is this: even after the war, as the second generation Americans begin to construct the narrative of how does America fit into the big story, there's an excellent sermon called Presbyterian and Its Affinities, given by a pastor named Albert Barnes. It's given in 1863. So again, if you know your history, that's during the American Civil War, where he really does show the affinities of Presbyterianism with the American Republic. And he connects all of this. In fact, he connects the American Republic to the Reformation. In many ways, this was a way the narrative was being constructed. So in a sense, it wasn't as if the Loyalists were wrong. It was there. It was happening. It was part of the language. So therefore, what we have here in the American Revolution is not just John Locke. We have John Locke doing his own little bits of hermeneutics of Romans, where he would say, well, we only have to obey the king when they are protecting our life, liberty, and property. So he does his own bit of hermeneutics there of Romans. But we also have this reformed tradition of revolt. Some scholars would say the resistance tradition is more of an Anglo thing than a continental thing. That's possible. But I do think you start to see, Whitty would argue that there's some of this even going on in the continent. But so when we look at the American Revolution, what we have here really is this combination of Enlightenment, Republican ideas, Whig ideas, and what Mark Knoll will actually call a Christian republicanism that has some of this reformed language tied in. Now, would John Calvin had been at the Boston Tea Party? Absolutely not. That is not him. He is, what do we make of this? Calvin, patriot or loyalist? Calvin would not have been okay with what happened in the American Revolution. I truly believe that. But his heirs, working with his tradition, certainly did see themselves in keeping with the tradition. So what do we do with this? One of the things I think that we can look at is there is a development theory, that these ideas develop over time. People realize that Calvin certainly laid out a good starting ground, but was dealing with a very different situation, and they applied some of his ideas differently. Hermeneutical shifts. Some people may argue, and there's an article in the list that would argue that really what this is bad hermeneutics. People forgot how to interpret the book of Romans. And all of a sudden they gave themselves license to revolt against the king, something Calvin never would have let them do. So some people would say they're just bad exegetes. So they might have thought they were reformed. They might have thought they were within the Calvinist tradition, but they're not really good Calvinists because they don't match up with Calvin well enough. And then, of course, there's this sort of Locke reform theology mix theory that kind of gets played into this as well. But I think when we look at this story, we have to see all of this at play. And I think what is really helpful, particularly when you're talking to college students, is this helps complicate the story of the American Revolution in a world that wants things very simple and black and white in monocausality. I always say to my students, Twitter is where nuance goes to die. And so that's where we're doing our learning. But actually, history is far more complicated. Sometimes the answers are not black and white. Sometimes there is ambiguity. And there's never just one single answer. And that's why I think this story, when I teach this story to my students, they get it. They get that it's complicated and sometimes it makes their head hurt, but it causes them to see a real situation where my hermeneutics matter, and how my hermeneutics can lead to a revolution, or am I going to use my hermeneutics to pray and just observe and take the suffering? And so that's where I think this is probably a good place to end and open up for questions.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. What a great angle on Calvin and his tradition. So anyone on the call, you're welcome to put questions in the chat. You'll also see in there a link to the reading list that was compiled for you. While we're kind of waiting to see questions, I was just looking at one in the Q&A. I would ask, often I ask for reading suggestions, but you've already done that. So I would ask maybe if you have any advice for people reading Calvin for the first time, just approaching the text, where you probably all have kind of impressions of Calvin and Calvinism. So
Yes.
anything of those, that would be helpful too.
Yeah. Right. Most of the time you bring up the name Calvin and right away everyone wants to go to predestination, and then that they think, that's the entire thing they're going to read. And of course that is a place where Calvin is. I mean, Calvin does live in that space, and even double predestination. But there's a lot more to him. There's a lot more to his theology. And I would say, whether you agree with him or not, where he's really putting his emphasis is on the sovereignty of God. And that becomes a strong point. In fact, I would argue probably the reason Calvin could kind of take the resistance position he did is because of his views on the sovereignty of God. That there's no mistake here, there's no problems here. Oh, nice. I can see this one there. Yeah. Rhonda, when you say how far apart, do you mean years wise or theory wise? Years wise, we're looking at about 200 plus years. Theory. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. At time, Thomas is certainly what he's doing in there is he is trying to marry Aristotle to Catholic, or to really what would be Catholic theology. On some of these ideas of resistance, I think you would see them very much the same. Also, too, they're similar in natural law. Some scholars would argue the reason that Calvin would take the position he would on some of these areas, like no space for pluralism, you don't want chaos with government leadership, is his views of natural law, which would have kept him in keeping with someone like Thomas Aquinas. In that idea of natural law. Calvin was a natural law guy. He used those ideas to the point where that would be why you wouldn't have multiple voices happening. If natural law tells you this is how things work, why would you allow someone to come into your holy commonwealth and undo that and talk unnatural law? Doesn't make any sense. So yeah, does that help answer that question, Rhonda?
Very good. I have another question. This is kind of going back to right where you started with the two kingdoms, so kind of Christendom and the state. So we've been talking about revolt in terms of the state, and we've been talking about, of course, the reformers in terms of Christendom.
Right.
Could you say more from Calvin's perspective, kind of why is it not a revolt within the church? What he's
That's
doing?
a great question, right? I mean, and I think you're right. I mean, we're not the reformers revolting against the church, right? And I think the argument there would be that they were reforming, the false church. But I think that's actually a good reason why some of the heirs of Calvin might come down and move the way they are. Like, okay, guys, I hear what you're saying, but you led a revolution against the church. Again, you could say they're the false church, and you have to do that. And I think that's exactly what some people did. They conflated those things like, well, okay, if you have to revolt against the false church, what happens if the state is pushing a false church? Now what? How do we do that? The other thing too, I think, is that this is so important to understand. This is the fear of what they saw, the anarchy that something like Anabaptism could cause them, I think, to be a little more cautious. The other thing is this: every edition of the institutes, even after Francis was dead, they were still dedicated to him. Every edition were dedicated to Francis I, the King of France. And the idea there is, because what Calvin wants to do is he wants to make an apologetic that even to the civil leaders, we are not Anabaptists. We are not the problem, right? We are not those people. We are not the libertines. We're not the fanatics. We're just saying that the Catholic Church has got it wrong, and they've deceived you as well. And so in some cases, you could look at these works as apologetics for Protestantism being the true religion. We don't want to undo Christendom. We don't want to live in separate kingdoms in that way. We see play for both. Again, you almost can't, particularly at the end of the Institutes, Calvin really just kind of goes into almost a rage against Anabaptists because he sees this as so damaging. And of course, there's also the fear of another peasant revolt and what that can cause. So there was real effect to Luther's movements that led to real bloodshed. And I think there was always fear of that. And there was fear of maybe even losing some credibility in the public square in that regard.
That's very helpful. We have another question from Micaiah in the chat. If it was believed that the state could be involved in church matters, such as heretic trials, which you gave examples of, what was believed at the time about the opposite of the church passing judgment on state matters?
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, this was Micaiah, great question. This is sort of a debate. Where's the line here? And again, we're talking a difference between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. And Calvin was clear that obviously he wouldn't have used this line, but stay in your lane. That there are lanes that we both need to stay in, and that the church needs to deal with issues on their own. In fact, Geneva is going to have something called a consistory, and the consistory is really sort of the immoral accountability group. Lots of Protestant cities had these. What we have to keep in mind about the Protestant Reformation is this. One, it's multiple reformations. That's one thing. Two, when you break away from the Catholic Church, when you splinter the Catholic Church in the 16th century, you are splintering the very thing that is the glue of Western Europe. It's not just a matter of, okay, we have a new religion now. How are you going to do anything? How is morality going to be governed? How are the hospitals going to be run? Some more monasteries. Where are the schools going to be? Everything has to be rethought. And that's where I think Calvin is helpful as a second generation reformer. He had the opportunity to take some time, process, and rethink those things. And okay, this is how we do this. And so when it came to this area, they did not want to get involved in sort of criminal matters. Where they would join forces is Calvin believes that the church has a certain authority, obviously, on someone like a Michael Servetus. But they don't have capital punishment. They don't have the same teeth that the state has. And therefore, this idea that the state is going to have to step in to protect the church. If you read Calvin's Institutes, he was very strong about the idea that the state should be protecting the church, protecting doctrine. And I'll go so far as to say this. I think even when we get to the American Republic, the founding fathers, even when they talk about separation of church and state, they still see a role for the state to support the church in some way, to support religion in some way. It's because they see it as a value. They see it as the way virtue is going to be maintained in a republic, because we all know what kills republics: lack of virtue. And so there is a sense of that. Even someone like Jefferson, who certainly was not a Christian, he liked a lot of what Jesus said, even though he may not have lived that way himself. But he still saw value in religion in that way. So even that far, that idea of separation of church and state, this idea that the church should be supported by the state in some way, even if it's not financially, it should be supported in a political way. But even in America, you got to remember, a number of churches were supported financially up until sometime the 1830s, until some of that happened. That's why the Baptists voted for Jefferson, was to get rid of some of that. So even in America, that connection between the church and state, and the state supporting the church, and in this case financially by having a certain tax, was still in play even in the United States with our Constitution.
That's great. Great question, Micaiah. Thank you. Well, we're to 8 o'clock. I'm amazed at how much nuance you've fit into 1 hour. It's been
good. I'm glad.
So very lucky. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Draper.
Thank you.
For the meeting list as well. I hope everyone on the call enjoys that and watching the recording. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.